So this week we are looking at Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. If you don't know, the quick background of Galatians is this. It was a church of non-Jewish people, which were not very common early in the church. Paul had established it. And one of the big debates in the early church was, because Jesus was Jewish, and because all his first followers were Jewish, that in order to be a Christian, you have to become Jewish first. Very weird thing for us to think about in our world. But that was the debate they were having, and they had landed on that no, you don't have to become Jewish to become a Christian. It was fine to be Jewish. It was fine to practice a lot of the cultural practices of Judaism, but they were not what made one acceptable before God. And so no one had to be Jewish before they were a Christian. So Paul established this church of non-Jewish people in Galatia and told them that. And then after Paul left, a group of people, they called them the Judaizers, came in. They were kind of a political group, but they were also a religious group. I know that's hard to imagine that there was a group that was political and religious, but just suspend your disbelief. And so they said, you do have to be Jewish. Paul was lying, Paul left stuff out, Paul was confused, whatever. But Paul was wrong, and you did have to become Jewish. And the two things they really hinged on were dietary laws and circumcision. And so that's what our whole letter to the Galatians is Paul saying, no, that true Christianity comes because of faith in Jesus, and that's what transforms a person. It is not laws, it is not rules, it is not nationality, it is not ethnicity. That is none of that is what makes a person acceptable from God. It's just putting your faith in the work of Jesus, and then that actually transforms you into a different kind of person. So we're on the end of Paul's letter, and a lot of this last chapter is just him solidifying what he said in the first 5. So Galatians chapter 6, starting in verse 1, Paul says, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit, all of chapter 5 was in the Spirit. If you guys heard Don a couple of weeks ago, he talked about this. Walk in the Spirit, don't walk in the flesh. And now the flesh at that point meant that sort of sinful nature, the selfish part of you. If someone, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. He's saying, here's the outline. Here's again what it looks like to be people in community who walk in the Spirit. But watch yourselves. Even people in the Spirit need to watch themselves, he says, or you may also be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If you remember in chapter 5, he said the law is summed up in this: love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. This is the law. So he says, the way you love your neighbor is to carry each other's burdens. And that's how you'll fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone, without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. So I was thinking about this idea. The part of this passage really stuck out to me was that you should take pride in yourself without comparing yourself to someone else. And one of the things that made me think about is the fact that there are things that I know about myself. And I don't know exactly when or how I learned them, but I just know them. One of the things that I know about myself, and it's not going to surprise you because you know it about me too, is I'm too short. I'm too short. I don't know what I'm too short for. Exactly. Right? To reach certain things in the grocery store, yes, I do know that at times. Right? Like to not have to stand on something to get to the top shelf. For the NBA, maybe the National Basketball Association. Even that is debatable. There's got to be Muggsy Bogues. I don't know if you guys know Muggsy Bogues. Yeah. 5'3", I think he played like 14 or 15 seasons.
That's right.
But that's kind of what I was taught when I was younger than I was teaching. What's that, Coleman's? You're in the right place, don't worry. You're like, I don't know over here. Hey, but it's even more than that, right? It's not just like I'm too short to be picked on your basketball team. I'm too short. Some people would say to be married to Jane. You want to stand up next to me real quick? She for sure doesn't wear heels in pictures. I know that. She quit doing that a while ago. But some people would say I'm too short to be married to Jane, and yet I'm married to Jane. Some people might think, like some in our world, would be like that it's not manly to be as short as I am, right? Like that's a thing, right? Like that I'm not a grown man if I'm not tall enough. And it's weird. I don't know that I'm too short because I feel too short. That's always what I tell people. I'm like, I just feel like I'm normal and other people are tall. Like, I don't think that I see things at a lower level or anything like that. I fit great in a plane and most hotel rooms and bathrooms. I'm perfect. Right? But I know that I'm short because I know that I'm shorter than most of the people around me. I know that I'm too short because I can compare myself. But another thing I know about myself, I'm not just going to wreck myself here, I also know that I'm smart. Right? And here's the thing. I don't know that I'm smart because I know a lot of things. There are so many things I don't know how to do. I can't build a car engine. I can't build a house. I can't build a jet. I can't read a football defense to know where to throw the ball. Right? I can't speak Spanish. I was terrible. I took Portuguese with Chrissy, and I struggled for a C. But I know I'm smart because my grades and my SAT scores were better than a lot of the people around me. Because I compared myself by those elements. And so growing up, those are things that just became a part of who I know that I am. I'm too short and I'm smart. But what's really weird about that is that as my vision of the world starts to expand, I also realize that depending on where I am, I'm actually really tall and stupid. Did you know that the average male height in Guatemala, I've been there, went on a mission trip and tried to live there, and I wondered why I tried to live there, this is probably why. The average male height in Guatemala is 5'2". I'm a giant in Guatemala. Right? And I'm an idiot in most finance team meetings or corporate real estate debates. Damn, what's that? Right? And the point is, a lot of my value and purpose, and a lot of what I think I can and cannot do and be, a lot of what has shaped me is based around comparisons. Is based around how I measure up to people that I happened to be around at the time that I was making those decisions about myself. And that's not just me. Right? It's all of us. You may not be too short. You might be too fat. You might be too thin. You might be too tall. Right? You might not be good looking enough. Nobody in this room. Right? You might not be in good enough shape. I had a friend who moved to the south from the West Coast, and he was like, my doctors on the West Coast used to hammer me because I was out of shape. And here my doctors think I'm in great shape. Right? You've compared your brains, your money, your kids, your marriage, your relationships, your non-marriage to people around you. And just like me, your definitions of what you are and even your definitions of what you could be have been built measuring yourself by who happened to be around you at the time and wondering if you could live up to it, and even if living up to it was what you were supposed to do. Most of our lives is spent hoping we will measure up, but guessing at where up is, and as up changes. So one of the things that I like for us to do, one of the things that COVID has made a little difficult, is I like for us to talk with each other. In the middle of the sermon. I like for us to have time to discuss things with each other. I think that's part of how discipleship takes place. So here's what we're going to do. If you want to talk with your household, you can talk maskless. If you want to talk with people who you did not ride in the car here with, we'll just say that, then we would ask that you would put on a mask. But here's the first question. Anybody want to bring it up? Here's the first question I want you to talk about. Or just think about it. You're just going to sit by yourself. How did you compare yourself growing up? Like, what did you measure? I said short, smart. Those were things for me. What were yours? Where did you excel? Where did you fall short? In terms, even though we use it as a tool, it's really not a great tool because it's hard to know who is me and what is me and what's just the me that I see in comparison to everybody else. Right? The me who's constantly trying to measure up or prove myself. Who am I? So the real question you start to ask at a certain age, right? Like, who am I outside of comparison? What's real about me? Right? One of the questions that is in my mind a lot is anyone really unique? Is there anything truly unique that I bring to the table that makes a difference? Right? And what comparison does is it chokes out that. It chokes out anything unique. And what we all have is like the story that I constantly have seen that a friend of mine was telling me the other day about this preteen that he knew, a neighbor of his, who suddenly turned goth. Right? Like with the makeup and the dark hair and all that. And really what that person was doing was they were becoming like everyone else in order to prove that they were different. Right? And that's what I ended up doing. What I ended up doing with comparison is I ended up measuring myself by everybody else in an effort to be something or someone that matters. And I lose the only things that I actually really own and are unique to me in the process. And the paradox of comparison is that it helps me hide from my worst fears. Right? My worst fears are that I'm nothing. My worst fears are that I'll never be anything. And in comparison, in some ways, helps me with that because I can always find somebody who's worse than me. It keeps me from having to admit that I might be as bad as I fear that I am, or even worse than that, I might not be anything. But it also keeps me from realizing my immense value and purpose, because my immense value and purpose will only come to fruition in what is unique to me as a person. Right? We can't be the best versions of ourselves, or really have any true impact on the world around us if we let comparison determine our value, our purpose, and our limits. And the biggest reason that's a problem for us as followers of Jesus, is that we believe that God made all of us in such a way that the world needs the best us. Right? And each of us, God looked at each of us and said, I put you in the place and the time that you are in, with a specific purpose that nobody else can fulfill. I remember when I was first talking to David Eldridge, who's the pastor at Stonebridge, about planting Highlands. I remember saying to David, I do not want to plant Stonebridge Jr. because it will just be a mediocre Stonebridge, and I would rather stay at a good Stonebridge than leave a mediocre Stonebridge. And so we don't need another Stonebridge in Marietta. We have a Stonebridge, and that was such a big part of it. If you wonder why we're so weird, that's probably one of the reasons we're so weird. But at the same time, here's something I'll confess to you guys. Especially when I feel insecure about Highlands, guess who I compare us to? And guess who I measure us by? Stonebridge. Right? That's exactly what I didn't want to be. And I love Stonebridge. But we don't need another Stonebridge. We need a Highlands in our community. But that's nothing new for churches. Right? The churches, just like people, because churches are full of people, measure themselves by the next closest church. Am I doing better? Am I doing worse? I feel really good about myself if I'm doing better. I feel really bad about myself if I'm doing worse. And the same thing was happening from the beginning of the church. Right? That's the church in Galatians. You have these people who are comparing themselves based on race, based on political positions, based on geography, based on gender. Right? The crisis in Galatia, this debate over what does it really mean to be a Christian, as opposed to creating a celebration of diversity, had left the church divided, arrogant, and judgmental. Stop me, that starts to sound familiar, right? People saw themselves as a particular type of Christian, and they looked down on other types because they compared themselves. If they saw one of the other Christians doing something wrong, they could feel smug. Right? They could say, well, we're not like those people. If they saw somebody in the body of believers behaving badly, they would just become critics. Right? They would think that's not the way that we behave. And it divided them from their real purpose. Paul said, it's dividing you from fulfilling the law of Christ. And that's this passage. He starts out and he points to this problem. It feels like a generic problem. He could have been dealing with some specific things, but he really speaks about it in broad terms. And he says, there's a sinful family member, brothers and sisters. This is language we should be familiar with, Highlands, right? The church only works when it understands itself as family, not as competition. And so he says, you need to restore this family member in sin. And then he says, here's the principle for spiritual people. You're responsible to look after one another. You're responsible to restore one another. The Greek word there, I'm going to share this one, not just to feel good about myself and fulfill my smart comparison, but because it's a really good word. It's katerkisto. And it was actually a term, it was a medical term. It was used for setting a dislocated bone back into place. That was the word, restore, to take a dislocated part of the body, right, and put it back into place. If you've ever had a dislocation, they're extremely painful because they're not in the right relationship to the rest of the body. Right? And actually to put a bone back in place. I've seen it. I've never had it done. I've seen it. You ever seen it or had it done here? And somebody, yeah, it is. It doesn't feel good, does it? It doesn't tickle. Right? It's actually painful. But there's a healing kind of pain. And this is what Paul's talking about when he says to restore, to be the family of God, part of our purpose, right? And this is why we can't compare ourselves to those outside of us, because this is really weird for the world to understand. That part of our purpose, part of our purpose together as the family of God, is to confront things that are out of place, even when it might be painful. Right? But a proper family member, and we may need to hear this within our own families, a proper family member will confront gently. A spiritual family member confronts gently. And Paul says gentleness is really hard in the family of God. And that's why you've got to watch yourself, because you can be tempted. Right? We won't be able to biblically confront or correct someone else here in the church if we think that we're not capable of similar or equal sin. If we forget our own capability to do evil, we can't confront someone biblically. If we feel like we're above the person, even if we try to hide it, it's going to come through. And we'll destroy the person, we'll destroy the relationship, and we'll destroy the image of God that we're supposed to be showing the world. Right? So Paul says, you've got to be gentle, to be spiritual, to be gentle. And so after he insists on that, right, he goes out of this idea of being tempted, or goes back to this idea of being tempted, and he brings up this thing of don't think too much of yourself in the process of restoration. And the NIV does a weird job of translating this, but really those two verses are connected, because what he's saying is that if you think too much of yourself, you're not going to be able to bear other people's burdens. If you think too highly of yourself, it will keep you from being able to bear burdens. And then he actually offers the solutions. Occasionally the Bible is super practical. And he says, this is it. This is the solution to not being too highly of yourself. Just examine your actions. Just examine yourself. Are you living in the Spirit? Right? You don't assess your standing before God by comparing yourself to everybody outside of you. You look at yourself. Right? Because what happens when a Christian compares themselves to someone outside of them, on the one hand, we will either, maybe we're doing our best But our best is different than the best of the people around us, and so we're condemning ourselves when we're really doing everything the Lord would require us to do. But on the flip side, maybe we're surrounded by some, not great people. And we're doing better than them. And we may think that we don't need to grow in the Lord in an area. Right? So you surround yourself by people that are mean and unloving. And if you're doing this much in terms of loving, you start to feel great. Or maybe the Lord's saying, like, no, there's so much more for you than that. Or maybe you're really, really hurt. And so the best you can do is say nothing. But maybe you're surrounded by people who aren't. They didn't experience the hurt that you experienced. And they're doing a great job. And you're constantly condemning yourself. By not taking into account that you're a different person than them. Christianity has a lot to say to how we understand ourselves so that we're neither arrogant nor condemned. And Paul says in the end, it's not going to matter how tall I was in comparison to the people around me, or how smart I was. He said, in the end, I'm going to have to stand before God and say, this is what I did with what you gave me. It's the parable of the talents. Maybe I got 2. Maybe I got 5. But it doesn't really matter if I got 2 or 5. What matters is that I believe enough in a loving God to do well with whatever God gave me. Right? And that's the legitimate pride that a Christian can have in themselves. Right? There's this sort of like false Christianity that masquerade around humility. Right? And we're like, oh, I can't do it. I'm just, for whatever me. And there's reality in that, right? Like Paul does say at times, he says, I'm the worst, I'm the chief of sinners, and I am nothing, the least of the apostles, right? And there's a proper realization of that. But there's a pride a Christian can take in saying that I have been faithful with what was given to me. It's not a pride that's based on hiding from your faults. And it's not a pride based on just comparing yourself to the tallest guy in the bottom. Right? It's a pride that comes in saying, God transformed my life, and I didn't throw it in the garbage. I did well with trusting God, with what He had given me and who He told me that He was. Right? So here's the next question. And then we're going to transition a little bit into what we do with all of this. So I want you to share an experience. We're just talking about how the church should treat each other. And I want you to share an experience of either feeling judged by or being helped by the church, the family of God. Sin is brutalizing. Like, when you know you've done something wrong, or you know what the wrong that you're capable of doing, if you really look at it, it's not a pretty thing. It's a dislocated body part, right? And so really it produces either arrogance or condemnation, and so we end up judging, and that's why it requires such a gentle hand in responding. Especially because we, as humans, we're so prone to sin, especially in our response to sin. How we confront people in sin is crucial. Gentleness and empathy. Right? And if we cannot, then we should not. Proverbs says, mockers stir up a city, but the wise turn away anger. It's a phrase that needs to sit with us as we seek to interact with the community in this time. We need emotional intelligence and self-awareness to a high degree if we're going to be Christians responding to sin. Right? Jesus said, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your family members' eyes, if we're not taking the time to self-evaluate, we have no business evaluating anybody else. And then as we evaluate, well, we're supposed to carry each other's burdens, right? My neighbor's sin is not theirs as compared to mine. It belongs to me. It belongs to the community. And when I carry my neighbor's sin as though it is also mine, not as though, but because it is also mine, is when I fulfill loving my neighbor. I want to do that because I want to insulate myself from criticism, or I want to condemn myself before anybody else can, which is just another form of self-protection. Okay, let's be honest. I condemn myself early so nobody else can get to first base before. Right? And that constant comparison keeps me so busy that I never really end up living a meaningful life. I just spend my life comparing so much that I think I'm actually doing something that matters. Right? Only God, who gave us purpose, has the ability to measure our worth and accomplishments. Comparing ourselves to each other will never get us there. So we're all stuck, though, in this paradox, right? Like comparison makes us feel isolated from everybody else and yet burdened by the fact that we have to engage because we measure ourselves by everybody else. And it's like every lie, the comparison judgment circle is just a distortion of my true place and purpose. People aren't here for me to compare myself to, and the answer isn't isolating myself from people. I actually find my true paradoxical purpose in being mutually accountable, but personally responsible. That's the way I live with purpose as a believer in Jesus in the world. When I as a Christian see my brother or sister stumbling into sin, I don't get to just run to the other side of the road and say I have too much to do like the Levite and the Pharisee did in the parable of the Good Samaritan. No, I have to move towards my brother or sister, but in gentleness, because they're beat up. The last person who approached him probably beat the snot out of him. And then I have to do whatever I can, and I have to work through the problem. I have to be willing to sacrifice. I have to be willing to spend so that we can get back to living in the Spirit together. Christians are responsible for each other. And because of the love of God that comes to us through Jesus by the power of the Spirit, we carry one another's burdens when those burdens are too difficult for one person to carry. We don't take pride in that because that's our purpose. That is what was done for us. Right? We help each other not because we're better than, but because in truth, we're all nothing without help. The help that Jesus gave us. And then I look at God and I say, I am here to help my community, but I'm not here to measure myself by my community. My religion is neither private nor someone else's responsibility. My faith is communal and impersonal. And that cuts against a lot of our culture. And it's part of why we live as a city on a hill, in a place where individualism is valued for all the wrong reasons, but never celebrated by the unique purpose that God gives us in that. Right? We are locked in to mutual accountability and personal responsibility. And God's not someone just looking over our shoulder, measuring us by what everybody else does. Right? God, as we see in Jesus, is the one who's constantly speaking both true but empowering things to us. Right? If you need to be reminded, God is often that voice in your head that contradicts the judgment, that contradicts the arrogance if we're willing to listen. It contradicts the fear and contradicts the purpose. And one of the ways that we know that we're not sensitive to God is that that voice is getting smaller and smaller and going away. And if we have any hope of embracing our purpose as the people of God here now, we have to learn how to cultivate hearing His voice again. The voice that's always advocating for who we are and consistently inviting us to stay open to the world without letting the world judge us. The fear of rejection, right? The fear of not measuring up keeps us back from our purpose. Right? It keeps us from ever being fully engaged with anybody, but always being terrorized by everything that everybody else does. Imagine a world where Jesus set us free to realize everybody comes in with a different set of opportunities. Everybody comes in with a different set of flaws. Everybody comes in with a different set of gifts. And yet you're equally loved and impossible to compare. Equally loved, but impossible to compare. In that world, the people of God are the most accepting and unjudgmental people in the world. Right? We're a place where we stop comparing ourselves to others, and people can be set free from that. Imagine if we started to look at our particular tasks, our particular responsibilities, and just said, I just need to respond to these things obediently. I just need to compare my life each day against who I am, and who I have been, and who I could have been, and who I could be in Jesus. It's funny, it's then that we would actually start to see something that we can legitimately take pride in. Right? Something that was ours and the Lord's, that He had just given us. Whether or not at the end of the day we were better or worse than anybody else. Taller or shorter, richer or poor, more acknowledged or less famous. Right? In that world, the church is a place where we don't compare ourselves with somebody who has done less than us and feel conceited pride, or somebody who has done more than us and feel despair and envy. In that world, we look at everybody and we say, God gave them a different load to carry than me and to serve Him with. And my task is to carry my individual load in a way that pleases God. Right? I'm uniquely purposed in Christ. And it's living into that I can be proud of. No matter how the world measures me. And it's living into that makes me a real service to the people around me. Because I don't need them to validate me. I know that they're there for the other God. So, quick application. How do you deal with it? How do you deal with it when you see people that you know are not doing well, or not doing right, or whatever you call it, especially those that would call themselves followers of Jesus? How do you deal with it? The enemy of dealing well with them is pride. Really. The enemy of dealing well with people in error is pride. And the weapon we use against pride is self-awareness. Right? I am nothing, but in Christ I have purpose. Right? I am no better, I am no worse. We have different things that we brought to the table. If that's a struggle for you, I encourage you to work this week to do two things. Evaluate your anger and judgment. When you see that happening this weekend, I know you'll see it. If you don't see it, I can send you some articles or whatever you need. But evaluate your anger and judgment. And don't be afraid of the fact that you're just as bad and just as capable of evil. Don't be afraid of it. Second thing is this. How committed are you to God's purpose for you? And the enemy of your commitment to God's purpose for you is comparison. The measure of a lasting life, according to the gospel, is helping others and living God's purpose. That's it. The measure of your life is helping others and living God's purpose. And comparison will always rob you of the beauty of both of those things. And the weapon against comparison is the one that makes us squirm. It's just God's voice. The only weapon you and I have against comparing ourselves to the world is the voice of God. Is that we decide that before we let every other voice in, that we are going to prioritize hearing God's voice. Run from comparison this week and run to God's voice. How do you run to God's voice? These are the easy church ones. You know all these answers. Right? It's prayer. But listening prayer, not just listening prayer. It's Scripture. It is a great place to go to learn about what God says about you. It's friends who love God and love you. And just asking them what they see. What do they see in you? That's part of bearing one another's burdens.